Good evening. I'm Dorothy Gale. I'm the chair of the program committee of the Northumberland Learning Connection. Welcome to the second half of NLC's Alberta Rebranded series. One cannot think of Alberta without thinking of cowboys, ranches, and Western frontier. Some historians refer to Alberta's early frontier as the tame West rather than the Wild West, restricting the latter to the United States. They attribute that characterization to the Northwest Mounted Police, our future RCMP, who patrolled Alberta from a series of forts across province. However, Warren Elofson, our speaker tonight, disagrees. He's a bit of a maverick himself in the world of historians. Warren remains a professor at the University of Calgary, although he stepped down as department head 10 years ago. He's a graduate of the University of Calgary in 1977, but did his PhD at Oxford, of all places, in 1986, after which he returned to the family ranch and ranched for 12 years prior to returning to academia. He is a prolific writer on the subject of frontier ranching in Western Canada. And like our last speaker, Kevin Van Tighem, Warren is a member of the Southern Alberta Land Trust working to preserve the eastern slopes of the Rockies. His well-documented historical books bear colorful titles, such as Cowboys, Gentlemen, and Cattle Thieves, Someone Else's Money, The Wowland Ranch Story, and Frontier Ranching Land in the Land and Times of Charlie Russell. His most recent book was co-authored with Clay Chataway, a patriarch of a ranching family and the grandson of Roderick Riddle McCleary, who founded Rocking Pea Ranch in 1900. It is titled Rocking Pea Ranch and the Second Cattle Frontier. Warren will tell us a bit about the original and the second cattle frontier in his presentation. The second frontier is when the smaller family farms replaced the large land leases in the early 20th century. But wait, I'll let Warren tell the story. Selected books by Warren are available at Furby Books in Port Hope and Let's Talk Books in Cobourg. Thanks to everyone for joining us by Zoom. It's really nice to see you again. And you'll listen to a speaker with both personal and professional experience with ranching. Remember to put your questions in the Q&A function at Zoom at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to them after his presentation. So without further ado, over to Warren, and will tell us how Canadians West really wasn't tame.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy. I will share my screen with you now and share my PowerPoint presentation and start the lecture. Okay, the story of the great ranches, and the great ranches is terminology that we've used for the big corporate ranches that established in Alberta in the late 19th century and disappeared very early in the 20th century. They're basically corporation ranches owned by shareholders, many of them, as we'll see, from Eastern Canada and Great Britain. These ranches basically attempted to incorporate the Texas cattle ranching system up here in the Canadian Northwest. And one of the arguments I'm going to make is that this was very unrealistic and didn't have a chance to succeed. And I'll try to point out the reasons for that. And one of the things I will say is that the first ranching frontier, basically I'm going to look at the frontier down in Texas, where it was first established, and then talk about how it moved from Texas to Montana and Wyoming, and then up to Canada. What I'm going to argue is it didn't really work anywhere. And one of the reasons it didn't work anywhere is the human tendency to overestimate the potential of almost any vast new and unfamiliar environment. What suddenly people became aware of in the sort of second half of the 19th century. If you're looking at people in who came west from the eastern United States and eastern Canada and Great Britain, I'm talking about the Anglos, I guess, mainly. They looked out on this great wide open area, and it's as if, you know, these people, particularly if you look at the British, and we're going to see a lot of sort of British involvement in this. These people lived in a sort of a society where, you know, there was a great deal of industry, a great density of population, polluted air, and there were people who, when suddenly they became aware of this vast, fresh, open area in the North American West, they just couldn't take the limits off their imagination. It was the area was unlimited in their mind, and I think their tendency to overestimate what it was capable of was part of that. Excuse me. And therefore they made mistakes. The other thing about a new frontier, of course, is that people don't, and this also spurs the imagination, people on a new frontier don't know the new frontier. They don't know what it's like. They don't know what the environment is capable of. These people who came west had no idea what they were dealing with. How could they? They had never experienced it before, and nobody from their society had ever experienced it before. So they're sort of guessing at what it can do. If you have to guess at what it can do, why not dream the impossible dream? So the Texas ranching system started in Texas and then moved north to Wyoming, Montana, and to Canada. Now those are the frontiers, the ranching frontiers that I'm going to talk about today. In Texas, the system that the ranchers felt would work, and these, as you'll see, were very, very big ranches. They used a system of what they called profound neglect. Basically, this is a system where you turn cattle out on the open range and leave them to look after themselves. It isn't very efficient. Because you know, there's nobody out there looking after these cattle. When they reproduce, there's no midwifery to make sure that the calves are pulled properly. There's no control of the branding, so calves are born at all times of the year. And also, there's a problem of keeping your quality up, because you can't control which bulls are working with which cows at what time of the year. Also, you know, there's a problem with when you've got an open range system of wild animals taking the cattle, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason this system was going to work was it was just incredibly low costs. You turn out all these cattle, you leave them out there on the open range. You hire cowboys to bring them in once in a while so you can pull the calves off of them and or pull the fat cattle off of them and to market. Otherwise, you leave them out there year in, year out. It's very cheap, very inefficient, but the idea was that it would work. Some of the big ranches, and I'll just move through a few of them quickly. The King Ranch covered 614,000 acres. One of the very first and one of the bigger ones that was there. King's wife, Henrietta, inherited the ranch with son-in-law Robert Kleberg's help. She expanded it to more than 1 million acres eventually. These ranching frontiers tend to produce some very tough and active women, and she was just one of them. Charles Goodnight and his partner, John Adair, established the J.A. Ranch in Palo Duro Canyon. Goodnight used the canyon walls as part of the ranch's enclosure, and the Red River as a source of water. The ranch included more than 1 million acres and 100,000 head of cattle. So these are absolutely huge ranches, and really bigger ranches than we'll ever see up in Canada, although we're going to see some very big ones that we don't have anymore. Matador Land and Cattle Company was one of the ones that acquired land in several states eventually, and was one of them ones that came up here, we'll see, and established itself in Saskatchewan. The largest ranch was the XIT, and it covered over 3 million acres. So, I mean, these are so big that we up here in Alberta or in Western Canada, we can hardly even imagine them. A big ranch, a really big ranch. I think the biggest one certainly the biggest family-owned ranch in Alberta today would be about 20,000 acres. So, and there are literally hundreds of them that are much smaller than that. We're talking big. We're really talking big. What killed the ranching system is people didn't understand the limitations of the area that they were using. They didn't understand the limitations of this grand new frontier. And they tended to put too many cattle out there, thinking, there's no end to how many cattle the plains can handle. When bad weather came along, such as a drought, and in Texas, we have bad winters up here. They have droughts down there. When those came along, the grass would be short. There wouldn't be enough of it to go around, and cattle would die. Then eventually, in came smaller ranchers, smaller farmers, and so on, who cut up the open range with barbed wire. Too many cattle to feed. Droughts reduced the herds before the farmers ever really established, but then in came the sort of farming approach. And 1873, Glidden invented the barbed wire fence. It was inexpensive and very effective in cutting up the open range. As the Texas frontier, cattle ranching frontier was operating, cattle were also being moved from Texas to the north and the northwest. Really, even long before it died out there, but as we'll see, it continued It continued on even as that occurred. One of the things that really made us here. So what's going to happen is the cattle from Texas many of the cattle from Texas are actually going to be moved north, and you think, well, okay, we live on the northern, the northern extremities where you have a lot of things like bad winters to put up with. What would make people think that an industry that wasn't successful in Texas could possibly be successful up here? Well, one of the reasons is a whole pile of promotional literature. And these are the ones I've got, you see in front of you there, are the Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains, which basically says it all, by James Brisbane. Dr. Hiram Latham's Trans-Missouri Stock Raising, the pasture lands of North America. Joseph McCoy's Historic Sketches of the Cattle Trade of the West and Southwest. And Baron Walter von Richthofen, Cattle Raising on the Plains of North America. These were promotional literature, basically pamphlets put out by these men, and there were lots of others as well, but these are the best known of them. Basically said that this is a wonderland. The North, you go up into places like Montana, Wyoming, and by association, Western Canada. And you're just going to find wonderful places for the profound neglect system to work. In his 1871 pamphlet, so they're writing this pamphlet literature, even as they well before the Texas ranching system is dead. Basically, Latham said that it was necessary to use cattle and sheep to convert grasslands into beef and mutton. The best way to do this was to rely on and expand the grazing approach, which was then being so successfully applied in the state of Texas. He said that there was a never-ending amount of virgin grazing land in the entire Great Plains region, and that its potential could easily be tapped. As the land was still unsettled, it could be accessed for little or no cost, and as grazing did not require tilling the soil, the purchase and operation of expensive implements was unnecessary. Moreover, as the animals could largely fend for themselves, few hands were needed to watch over them. Now, this is a man who knows nothing about the area. If he had known anything about the area, he would never have said that the cattle and we're talking about sheep as well, could fend for themselves up in this area. Brisbane quoted what he claimed were the glowing appraisals of ranchers who had grazed cattle in Montana. I'm just going to there, that's better. These he then used to support his opinion that there was no place in this section of the country where cattle and sheep will now winter safely with no feed but what they will pick up. All the flocks and herds in the world could find ample pasturage year-round on the unoccupied plains and the mountain slopes. And basically he's talking, as I say, about Montana. Imagine these people saying this, and imagine a world in which people from the East and overseas are just so anxious to believe it. And you know, it's hard for us to understand, but that's the way it was. This vast area, said McCoy, is covered with a fine species of grass, which is equally nutritious in winter as in summer. Either cattle or sheep not only live well, but fatten fast, so long as they can get an abundance of buffalo grass. No matter how cold the air may be, so warm and nutritious is this grass at all seasons of the year that cattle or sheep do not care for hay or other feed in the wintertime. And again, anybody who's experienced winter up here, you just shake your hand at these kinds of descriptions. And I wanted to quote the descriptions so you'd see exactly what these people are saying. That's what they said, and that's, as we'll show you, is what the great ranchers believed when they headed into this new area. James Cox was a journalist and a man who lived close to the ranching frontiers and watched what happened. And he was amazed. He called this mass hysteria as these new companies started heading to Montana, Wyoming, and Canada. He said that a London newspaper explained with great care how a yearling steer could be purchased for the incredibly low price of $3 or $4, fattened on Western ranges at next to nothing, and then sold at about $60 to $70 net. So this is what people believed. They were going to buy these cattle for next to nothing. The cattle were going to go out on this open range, and they were going to just fatten so quickly and for so little money, and apparently for so little death loss that you just couldn't go wrong. In order to demonstrate the truth of these remarkable figures, Cox said that paper had absurdly estimated that so rich were the pastures that an ordinary steer of 3 years could be expected to weigh from 1,200 to 1,500 pounds and yield 1,000 pounds of marketable meat. Such figuring was idiotic, he said. But its influence was evident from the tremendous rush of inexperienced investors to the West, all determined to buy cattle at half or a third current prices, raise them at a third or fourth the actual cost, and sell them at figures about double the ordinary quotations for 2 and 3 year olds raised in the manner so described. So what happened was there is all of a sudden a demand for these cattle, these Texas cattle, up in on the Great Plains in Montana, Wyoming, and Western Canada. And so you have these, the Goodnight Loving Trail was opened up. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, recognizing the demand, started buying up cattle and trailing them north on the what has now been known as the Goodnight Loving Trail. Also the Chisholm Trail. Black Beaver, a Lenape or Delaware guide and rancher, and his friend Jesse Chisholm did the same thing on the Chisholm Trail, and there were others as well. Two that became very well known up here in Canada, Tom Lynch and Jordan Emerson took trailed cattle to Montana, Wyoming, and Oregon, and then up to Canada, and they spent a lot of time up here in Alberta, and were very well known. So off it started. Nelson Story drove his own herd up from Texas to cattle in 1866. Story and his ranch in the Paradise Valley became the leading cattleman on the Northern Plains. And Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Lonesome Dove is very basically based on Nelson Story's story. If you look at Wyoming and Montana, there are quite a few of the people that went there, or quite a few of the owners of these ranches were from Great Britain. And we'll see this is what happened in Canada, but to a greater degree. Powder River Cattle Company of Wyoming, with a capital stock of 300,000, included among its directors the Duke of Manchester, William Stewart, Lord Henry Neville, Ernest Burkle Denison, and Andrew Whitten. And they're basically British. When you have somebody, the Duke of Manchester, you've got some real blue blood there. Duke is the second highest title that an aristocrat in Britain can have. People came in from France as well, and this is the best known of them. The W. Barr Ranch in Weebaw County was the main owner of that branch was a Frenchman whose last name was Weebaw. At its peak in the 1890s, the W. Barr outfit owned 65,000 cattle and 300 saddle horses. So big company ranches. This one owned by Pierre Weebaw, but we'll quote an owner of these. Normally they have a substantial number of stockholders as well. And the DHS, Davis Hauser and Company, was one formed by Americans, Hauser, Granville Stewart, and Aaron Davis, and one of the best known down in that country in Montana. Crow Creek or Coal Ranch in northwest of Cheyenne, Wyoming, founded in 1879, is just another one. So there are the cattle trails. The orange is a Chisholm Trail. They would take these up as far as they could and then sell them to the ranchers up there, who would then trail them further north. Eventually, the railways started coming along in 1881 and helping to disperse the cattle when necessary, particularly the railways up in Wyoming. I'll show you in a second here. The green is the Goodnight Loving Trail. And then there's the Western or Dodge City Trail. Those are the main ones that these long cattle drives were associated with. And so there, starting in 1881, we get the Northern Pacific. We get these railways in Wyoming and in Montana, I should say, but also the Canadian Pacific Railway built across Canada in the early 1880s. The best thing about these, not the best thing, but they helped to make this, first of all, to clear the land of the buffalo, because suddenly you could kill the buffalo and ship their hides east, where there's great demand for their hides for leather production and so on. Basically, very quickly, the buffalo were who used the grasslands before the cattle came, disappeared very quickly. Also you had to settle the land by taking it away, and in the American case, quite ruthlessly, by warring the native tribes and basically wiping them out. Custer's, remember the Custer's Last Stand in 1876. After Custer and his outfit were wiped out, along came the U.S. Army and basically put an end to native, the threat to the industry of native peoples. So all of this, well, as evil as it may have been, it opened up the area to these cattle rustlers. In Canada, we didn't have to go out there with the army or anything to wipe out the native peoples. There's been lots written about that. Dazchuk's Clearing the Plains is one of them, and basically shows how we tended to starve them out and then let them sort of give in to the horrible weather up here in the north, and so on. We didn't have to rain down the army on them. It all looked good. These cattle headed north. All of a sudden, in Montana, just as a for instance, and this is just a quote from one of the articles I read in the newspapers, the number of Montana beeves jumped from about 2,500 in 1880 to 600,000, or 250,000 to 600,000 by 1883. Grass waving as far as the eye could see, no fences or towns in sight. The open range ranches appeared to be an institution here to stay. Now, I'm talking about Montana and Wyoming, and I'll move on and talk more about the Canadian situation here in a minute. Well, not in a minute, right now. The great ranches in Canada basically were promoted by the Conservative government in the East. Clifford Sifton was the Minister of Immigration and a staunch conservative. The Conservatives had initiated what they called the open door policy, which was a policy to let in as many people from as many different parts of primarily Europe as possible. They wanted white people, of course, because in those days that's the way people thought. They're open door, but they also wanted to make sure that they had an Anglo majority. And so one of the things that seemed attractive to them was to bring in Easterners from Eastern Canada, but also people from Great Britain. So they sort of promoted the pamphlet literature that I've just talked about. We're glad to have people believe that and head west and start up these great companies. So who did they get? The great ranchers. Now you notice I put quotation marks around great ranchers every time I use the term, because I don't honestly think they should be seen as that great, I guess. People who knew nothing about ranching. Most of them didn't know anything about cattle. Senator Matthew Cochrane had a 1,100-acre farm in Compton, Quebec, where he raised purebred shorthorn cattle. But he made his money primarily through a leather processing and shoe factory that employed some 500 people, and as a founder of the Eastern Townships Bank. I mean, in a way, he was a cattleman, but he certainly didn't know anything about grazing cattle on the open range or anywhere else. So John Walworth, there's a ranch out here that is normally erroneously called the Waldron Ranch. It should be the Walron Ranch, but the person who put it together was Sir John Walworth. He was a British member of the upper gentry, which means he was a landowner in Britain. His son-in-law was a titled aristocrat. The Earl of Latham of the Oxley Ranch was a British aristocrat who also leased out his large estates and in Britain. And his partner, Alexander Staveley Hill, was a high-ranking official in the Conservative government, respectively of Lord Salisbury and Arthur Balfour. Sir Hugh Allen from Montreal, who financed the Bayou, made his money as a shipping magnate, railroad contractor, and miller. The British-owned Stair Ranch, the Turkey Track, controlled by English-born Edward Whiteside Creswell and A.J. Tony Day. So a lot of these sort of British ranches all over the place, all of a sudden were leasing land out here in the West. What the government did is they allowed them to lease up to 100,000 acres, which of course there's nothing near that size out here these days. They let them lease up to 100,000 acres. And many of them, like the Walron Ranch, would simply take out leases in different names. And, like the Walron eventually had 300,000 acres. But also some American ranchers as well. The Circle Diamond was one of them. Frank G. Bloom and M.D. Thatcher of Colorado. And the 76 Hitchcock and Matador ranches in what is now Saskatchewan, and then the Douglas Lake and Gang ranches in BC. They were some of the American outfits that came. If we concentrate, I mean, this would be true about Montana and Wyoming as well. But if we concentrate on the Canadian part of this, I think one needs to point out that the real cowboys were Americans. Many Americans came north in this period, more Americans than any other social group or national group. And the best of them, or the best known of them, of the cowboys who were up here, were all Americans. The celebrated Bronco Buster Frank Ricks, the one-time foreman of the Bar U, Everett Johnson, the Cochrane Ranch Cowboys, W.D. Kerfoot, Jim Dunlop, and a Mexican known as Casus, and the first Walden Ranch foreman, Jim Patterson. All these men had, like cattle traders George Emerson and Tom Lynch, who stayed here eventually, learned their trade on the ranches in the American West. They were practiced cowhands, and they became the role models for the young men who followed them in from Eastern Canada and Great Britain. And this is important because there has been a tendency to say, because these ranches that showed up, so many of them were British, that really, the Canadian West, unlike the American, had a sort of British flair to it and a British social culture to it. And it really isn't true. I think it was as sort of Western American looking and acting as in Montana or almost anywhere else in the United States. You had the Black American rancher, John Ware, who has become famous in recent days. One-time owner of the Bar U, George Lane. American outlaw, Henry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid. Remember, you may have seen the movies with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The Wild Bunches, as they've been called. He was up here and worked on the Bar U Ranch for some years and before going back down to the United States. Many wannabes also came over to work on these ranches. They wanted to be cowboys. They had read about the cowboys. They had read about what the promoters had said. There were a huge number of dime novels that sort of glorified the cowboys of the West. It showed a lot of gunfights and that kind of thing, but basically these were real men and in everybody's eyes. And these young Easterners headed to local shops the minute they got off the planes or the trains in Calgary to secure the wide-brimmed hat, the skin-fitting high-heeled boots, the bright shirt and gay bandana, and the spurs and chaps they needed to look the part of the working cowboy. There were also the remittance men who were sent out here. Some of them were remittance men who were sent out here like that, sort of ne'er-do-wells from Great Britain, whose families had money and so on, and sent them out here to sort of try to make men of them. But whatever the case, they very quickly transformed into the picture of the Western cowboy. In the 1870s, one rancher stated no one on the northern Great Plains had ever heard tell of a cowboy, but in the 1870s. But by 1883, leather chaps, wide hats, gay handkerchiefs, clanking silver spurs, and skin-fitting high-heeled boots had become an institution. And so when we celebrate with things like the Calgary Stampede, this makes sense because we were a cowboy. We were a cowboy culture, a cowboy society at that particular time. The other thing I would say about them is they not only quickly tried to look like cowboys, these people, many of them were in fact Americans, but the ones that weren't very quickly acted like Americans. And they not only look like it when we look at them in the pictures. These pictures I got from the Glenbow archives in Calgary. They were also armed, and as we'll see, one of the things that people have said about them, particularly the sort of first historians who talked about this period in Canada's West, have said they didn't wear guns up here. They certainly did, and all you have to do to figure that out is go to, and this is Sir John Lister Kay, for heaven's sakes. Look at him with look at the gun belt over his shoulder, the rifle in his hand, and so on. But the old gun and holster Yeah, there are tons of pictures of these men with their guns and holsters, and very proud of them, looking exactly like Americans, American cowboys or American Westerners at least. And you see here, you see the gun there, you see the gun there. This is a gun belt going down across his middle there. Picture after picture you can find of these young cowboys, and you can see they've got an Eastern manager who never really quite made the transformation, whatever this picture is of. But this is a group. This is an outfit that was there in the 1870s and 80s. They look like American cowboys. Here's George Lane. Obviously, this is a watercolor done of him. George Lane, the eventual owner of the Bayou Ranch, and one of the big four, shooting a wolf, attacking his horse out there with the 6-gun. Pictures worth 1,000 words. And this is what the young men look like out here in the West. This is a roundup crew in the Porcupine Hills, where so many of these ranches started up in southwestern Alberta. There's John Ware and his wife and children. John Ware, eventually his wife died. I believe it was pneumonia. He was killed when his horse tripped, and they both fell, and the horse on top of him, and it killed him. And so rather a tragic ending. But one of the famous Westerners out here came north with the cattle herds, worked on the Bayou in particular for some time, and then started up his own ranch. There's a picture of George Lane after he became sort of uppity and became one of the big four and so on. It looks like he's doing very well. George Lane, I say none of these ranches did very well at all. And George Lane, when he died in the early 1920s, the ranch, the banks came and took away everything he had. He was absolutely, completely broke. There were some ranches that tried to maintain a British character, but there were few and far between. One of the ones I know of is the 44 Ranch near Grandam, and they would have they would try to emulate the fox hunt, and they would have these hound dogs that would chase the coyotes, and they would perform these hunts. I don't think they worked very well with the coyotes, but they felt they were being British, I guess. James Cox, again, a man who knew what he was talking about, and watched this whole thing happen, both in the States and pertaining to Canada as well. He said he was unimpressed with the whole thing. And these are quotations from his writings. Undue haste to become rich and to find the road to wealth caused the killing of the goose to secure the golden egg. He said, these people rushed out there. They didn't know what they were doing. There was a wild rush into the range country on the part of people inexperienced in the cattle business, but anxious to participate in the profits said to be so easily made by cattle raising there. In the opinion of the most conservative members of the trade, these were the men who broke down the prosperity of the industry in the West and Southwest. And you can see it. I mean, these people rushed out to a country they didn't know, to an area that they didn't know, to an environment that they didn't know, and tried the profound neglect, the Texas system up here in Canada, but also Montana and Wyoming. First thing that Cox pointed out, and he's absolutely right, that these cattle, first of all, I mean, not only bringing cattle out to throw out on the open range up here, anybody today knows would not work. You can't leave cattle out to fend for themselves in the wintertime here, when the vast storms come along and there's nothing for the cattle to eat out there. But one of the things he pointed out is they even paid too much money for these cattle. The cattlemen who made the most money were those prepared to sell to these novices. Suddenly, Cox pointed out, the cattle raisers and producers who had been content to risk their lives as well as their capital with only a prospect of moderate returns woke in the spring of 1882 to the fact that their herds were veritable gold mines. So these are people selling to the people that are starting up the new ranches in Montana, Wyoming, and Western Canada. Cows and calves had advanced in a comparative short space of time from $8 to $10 a head to $30 and $35 per head, while youngsters, yearlings, and 2-year-olds had advanced almost 300% in 3 years. So, you know, they're so anxious to get out there because they believe the pamphlet were the pamphlet writings that they've been reading. The newspapers have been passing this stuff along in Britain and in Eastern Canada, Eastern United States. And these people are just so anxious to get their cattle and get out there that they just overpaid for them. And a lot of the cattle, they're overpaying for many of the cattle that come up from Texas, but also they went into the American Midwest where you had a lot of sort of dairy cattle and small sort of farmers and small ranchers with cattle and just bought anything they could get their hands on, and they just paid too much for it. And one of the problems, and this was pointed out by the U.S. Beef Commission in 1888, who was trying to figure out what in the heck had happened here. In many instances, it discovered where Texas cattle were bought at $20, they paid $40 a book on the book account. Now, book account, I mean, they didn't, what it tells us is they didn't even count their cattle. Okay, basically they would say, you know, so say you've got, I don't know, maybe you've got 1,000 head of cattle that somebody has brought up from Texas. They're all together. You can't count them out there sort of in an open range situation, and they're very hard to count, but they didn't bother counting them. What they did is they say to the people, well, how many do you have? And whoever brought the cattle in would say, well, this is our book. And they would show them the book, and the book, of course, is the book account that originally, before you started the drive, showed how many cattle were in the bunch, how many cattle had been bought in the bunch, but it doesn't tell you how many had been lost. It doesn't, and there's no proof that the book account was right to start with. And the ranchers said, okay. The same thing held good in Wyoming territory, the price there being about $30 per stock cattle. Plenty of sales were made where cattle were sold at $30 a head, and on book account, they cost $60 or more. And that's telling you, this is the U.S. Beef Commission. So, you know, you're not only, if you knew how many cattle you had, it'd be one thing. The fact that you don't know how many cattle you have, and you're taking these people's book account for it, the Beef Commission says that they were taken advantage of in many cases. Counting on the open range is very difficult. The other thing that suffered was quality. People were so anxious to put these herds together for the Canadian and Montana, Wyoming ranches, but particularly I think here in Canada. We know it's true here anyway. Speculators as well as ranchmen who wanted stock for breeding purpose went to the American Midwest to find extra supply. And stimulated by the high prices they were willing to pay, the cattlemen allowed themselves to be virtually skimmed of cows and heifers. That's in the American Midwest, and that's some of these smaller owners, farm owners, and so on were stationed. Many of which, now this is Cox's words, many of which were of such poor quality they'd been earmarked for the packing house. Okay, and if you look at if you look at the Walrond Ranch papers in the Glenbow archives here in Calgary, what Cox said spans out. In 1887, Duncan McEachran reprimanded one of his administrators for overselling the breeding stock. The man assured him that the vast majority he had marketed were substandard, as there were so many that could be described that way in the original herd. I have no doubt, he said, that we killed, so again, this is an actual quotation, I have no doubt we killed a few that you would not want killed. But most had various flaws, including big bags. Cows get really old, they get a huge bag on them, and they have even walking around is not particularly comfortable for them. Or big jaws. There's a disease known as we knew as big jaws when we were ranching, and as soon as an animal got that, you sent them to the packing plant. Or were non-breeders or cripples, or cows as old as to be toothless and consequently almost certain to die within the next year or two. You remember, he said that the original herd contained a large number of old cows, and we understood that one of the benefits the company would derive from the contract to provide beef to the native bands would be to turn them into money and get the herd cleaned up. One cowpuncher, from the Bayou remembered that in the beginning, that outfit, in common with other ranching enterprises, was compelled to purchase as its foundation stock cattle of a low and inferior type. Well, first of all, I'm just going to quickly show you some photos of some really good beef cattle. These are modern day beef cattle. This is a Hereford breeding bull. Look at the flesh on that animal's body. Look at the hindquarter and look at the shoulder where some of the best beef comes from. And look at how much there is. There's another one. This is a 2-year-old heifer, another half year, so she could be ready. She's being fattened on a rich grassland or a feedlot, as is often the case now in Alberta. She would be ready for the slaughter. But again, look at how rounded she is. Look at how rounded her body is. There's another one. You can imagine if you killed that animal, heifer or steer, rather than bull, you would get a substantial percentage of the body weight would be in good beef. This is an Aberdeen Angus cow. Again, look at the shoulder, look at the rump, look at how fat she is. Angus bull, the same thing. And then you get lots of Hereford Angus crosses, which are normally a black body with a white face. And these are some of the cattle when we had a feedlot business, my brother and myself, we produced a lot of cattle. The cattle we put on our feedlot were normally Angus Hereford or Angus Hereford crosses. Okay, now here's what we actually got in those days. This is Montana. And just compare these animals. First of all, what you see there, the coloring isn't right. Okay, it's sort of patchy. It looks like sort of dairy cattle that you would find on a dairy farm. I think too, what we have here is quite a mixture of sort of beef cattle and beef cattle with a mixture of beef cattle and dairy cattle, but also beef cattle and Texas Longhorns. I'll just show you some more pictures. Here's a herd out there on the open range. You can see right off that the coloring isn't right, and if you look closely at the rump, I don't know if you can see my arrow there. The rumps of these cattle, they're very small and nothing like what I just showed you. Here's some more. You'd swear that they were dairy cattle or dairy crosses. And as I say, I think Texas Longhorns as well. But look at the rump on that compared to the ones I've just been showing you. And here again, look at this. And if you got close to any of this, I mean, none of these cattle seem to have any significant amount of fat on their bodies at all. So you can actually get pictures of so much out here that sort of proves that what we were doing really shouldn't have worked, couldn't have worked. The problem is novices getting into a business that they don't really understand. These are Texas Longhorns. And again, if you look at those and compare their bodies to these, they're pretty close, which suggests Texas Longhorns in the mix. The other thing we got were a lot of strays cripples, or a lot of cripples that strayed out of the treks north, straight out of the herds, largely because they couldn't keep up. This is Duncan McEachran of the Wallen Ranch again, told TC Power, who had sold him the stock, that his man Raymond reports quite a number on your range at Warm Spring. Will you please instruct your hired man to deliver all cattle branded WR to Raymond? He says Mr. Brooks claims 6 cattle of ours, which he says were crippled and therefore dropped out of the drive north and were never branded. Brooks has no right to do so. At the time, I did object to a few cripples among the cattle originally purchased, but he would not let us reject them, and they were driven out into the herds for the trek north. Some could not keep up and therefore fell out and were left along the way to be gathered later. I would be sorry if Mr. Brooks would give us any trouble in the face of the fact that I paid you for 2 of your cattle, which we found in the herd after reaching here. So again, a problem with the cattle, overpaying in many cases for cattle you never even got. The other problem is reproduction on the open range. You get some of these poor cattle up here. You get stray bulls that aren't very good breeding bulls. You get a lot of, and you can throw as many good bulls out there as you like, but they're going to be breeding with inferior stock, and it's just. And then you get sort of bulls born out there on the open range that don't get castrated when they should be, and they breed, and it's just so hard to clean up the herds once you've got these sort of secondary types out there on the open range. The other problem with the open range, of course, is you can't time your births, so your cattle are breeding all year round. And you have an awful lot of cattle that die, an awful lot of calves that are born in the wintertime, they're going to die, even if otherwise they would have been healthy. So reproduction on the open range, but it took years, as they said, to weed out the inferior animals and place them with a better type in an open range environment. So bad from beginning to worse. What really killed the business, both in all 3 frontiers that we're talking about up here in the north, was the bad winters. There were a number of them. The ones that I've read about most are those, and again, I'm quoting from people at the time. This is in Montana. Grazing areas were already overstocked, and we did tend to overstock as well. It's just one more of the sins these ranchers committed. During the winter of 1885, freezing snow and cold destroyed many herds, and the following dry summer left little grass for remaining cattle, yet more cattle arrived to fight for the diminishing pastures. And so that's a problem as well. 1886/87, just a terrible winter. By January, the drifts had filled the ravines and coulees almost level. The previous summer had a prolonged drought, and the starving cattle died by scores of thousands before their helpless owners' eyes. This is journalist L.V. Kelly, who was a journalist in Calgary and wrote he wrote a book on the industry here, and this is just. This is his book, Rancher's Legacy. Clustering in the coulees or huddling in the open, the animals suffered and died in enormous numbers. Again, this is a local person describing what happened. Some breast high in packed and crusted banks of snow died as they stood, some sheltered somewhat by bluffs or coulees, but unable to get at the grass through the deep cover of white, starved pitifully, ravenously, searching for food until the frost had reached their vitals. In the spring, Kelly remembered the bodies of great steers were found, heaps of them with their throats and stomachs punctured and torn by sharp splinters from dried and frozen branches and chunks of wood which they had swallowed in their anguish. Many of the cattle just lay down in the snow to die. When Cowboys found them buried in the drifts or lying too weak to get up, they used their 6-shooters to put them out of their misery. Alfred and Ernest Cross, one of the best known private ranchers up here, believed that few of the ranchers lost less than 40% of the animals they had on the open range that winter, some losing 100, many losing 75%. So, and I could go on. I talk about the Corn Ranch and others as well, but there you go. So what you have by this time is many of the open ranges had lost huge numbers of cattle, and many were in dire straits. Just to show the naivety of these ranchers, this is a quotation from Duncan McEachran of the Walren Ranch. And so these are his exact words. And I got this out of the Walren papers in the Glenbow archives. Snowstorms, he said, snowstorms sometimes last for 2 or 3 days. Now he's writing home to people back in England, during which time from 7 inch to 8 inches of snow will fall, but is light and powdery and rarely pocks. Wind, the wind which prevails almost continuously is known as the Chinook wind. Being of a high temperature, the snow sometimes disappears within a few hours. Ice crusts are scarcely ever seen there. On the contrary, the snow seems to evaporate, for it leaves no slush or mud behind it. Consequently, particularly on the slopes of the foothills facing towards the west, from which these winds generally blow, the cattle have no difficulty in getting at the long, thick grass. So that's the rumor that these people all believe. The snow comes, it melts away really quickly. The Chinooks take it, and the grass underneath the snow will be wonderful for them to eat. No shelter of any kind is provided for them anywhere, so they are left to care for themselves as they best can, after the manner of the thousands of buffalo which preceded them on the ground. Buffalo are made for the cold weather, cattle are not. It is customary in ranch companies to write off 5% for losses, but on well-managed ranches in the Alberta district, the percentage of loss is less than 3%, and I know a company where 1 to 2% represented the average loss. So the killing winters, here they are, 1886, 87, 1906, 07, by which time many of the ranches had shut down anyway. But lots of others that you keep coming across as you read what the ranchers said about particular winters of the time. That the 1885 I talked about already, 1891 to 2, 1892 to 3, 1896 to 7, 1897 to 8, and 1902 to 3 were all very bad winters, and not as famous as the other two, but very bad killing winters as well. This is the spring of 1907. Just a picture that is in the Glenbow archives. Cattle, when they die in that condition, they swell up, and you can see that they are swollen up. But the death loss is absolutely tremendous. Other things that got them, I don't know how my time is doing now. I should try to finish this as fast as I could. Timber and gray wolves, I could. Sorry.
Yeah, if you can try and pull it to a close, that would be good.
Okay.
Got some questions. Okay,
timber and gray wolves, a very, very big problem. The mange, a disease that would go through the cattle on the open range, and it was just a terrible, terrible disease. I won't go into it. On the open range, I mean, it's the worst place you can have cattle because they just keep passing it back and forth to each other. You have to build great chutes to run these cattle through, and then they very quickly get this disease back again. And two-legged predators, and I'm sorry, but we had lots of them up here. Early historians tried to tell us that the people up here were basically the basic British character that so many of the early ranchers from both Eastern Canada and overseas carried with them. It overcame the normally pervasive influence of the environment and relegated it to a secondary role in shaping the new society. The Canadian frontier was peopled by peaceful, law-abiding ranchers, families, and government encouraged colonists. In this instance, it does appear that the inherent British respect for legal authority and desire to perpetuate tradition survived its period of exposure. And it's just absolutely not absolute nonsense. This myth was also paraded around by the Northwest Mounted Police themselves. And if you look at what actually happened and you quote from, say, the real police reports, we have endeavored to patrol the country as usual, and where we have been successful in arresting many cattle thieves and other delinquents, advantage has been taken of our inability to keep up as formerly by cattle thieves and others to follow their unlawful calling. The detailed list has been forwarded to commanding officer at the Moosomin The subdivision reported on 26 November 1890 is a rather long one, including many different kinds of offenses. And you can quote them. Here's Warnick from the Walwyn Ranch. There seems to be a great deal of horse stealing going on, and a number of breeders have lost a good many horses since last autumn. Some arrests have been made lately, and I hope convictions will follow. And then I've quoted from the newspapers here, and just no problem finding. And this is Kelly, whose book, The Rangeman, I talked about earlier, since handed out to cowboy rustlers in 1903, had still not resulted in any marked reduction of boldness or frequency. 20 prisoners sentenced to terms varying from 1 to 10 years have been sent up from the McLeod district alone during the previous year, but the docket for 1904 was as populous as before. And the so-called running iron was out here. Which was a blank kind of iron that you could take any brand and change it to your own brand. And just a technique that these people used. They used it up here just as they used it on the other side of the border. And quite often ranchers on both frontiers, when they rounded up cattle, they would find unbranded cattle and they would just automatically put their own brand on it. So the ranchers stole from each other fairly regularly as well. Okay, so we've already talked about the second cattle ranching frontier, and this is the one that really settled the West. It's the family ranch. These ranchers, much smaller. The biggest, as I say, would be something around 20,000 acres, but many of them much smaller than that. These people came in, they fenced off the open range, they put up feed, they looked after their cattle, they brought their cattle in, treated them with tender, loving care, brought them in the wintertime, made sure they were protected by high board fences and barns and so on from the open range. They settled, these people also, we owe it to them, they built homes, corrals, barns, roads, they put out forest fires, and built schools and churches and all of that, and they did it with their own hands. They settled the West. The early ranchers, the so-called great ranchers, did not. And so I was going to talk about the maverick reputation of the province. Perhaps if any of you have questions about that, I can deal a little bit with that as well. But I'll turn it over to you now, and thank you for your patience.
Oh, thank you. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And there we go.
Very good looking.
Well, thank you, Warren. I think that's a really good synopsis. Those people who've followed the lecture, a lot of this comes from the book, the Cowboys, Gentlemen, and Cattle Thieves, which I read and I really enjoyed, I must say. It's really well written. It doesn't read like a history book. It reads like fiction. And yeah, it does. I shouldn't say that because it wasn't a fiction, was it?
No, it wasn't.
We did have one question.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm just saying that so much of what I gave you came from quotations that I took out of the correspondence of the ranchers, the newspapers of the time, journalists who were there, and so on. I mean, it's just all true, and that's all there is to it. And so I wanted to present that. I know it may be a maverick approach, but it shouldn't be, because it's the truth. And historians have to tell the truth. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. No, that's wonderful. And what I enjoyed about your book is that with all the references in the back, I just wondered if you'd like to comment. The number of things that affected the great ranches, and there were the predators, the wolves, there were the hard winters, there were the rustlers, and there was some mention about Indians too. I mean, we won't go into all that, but do you think it was the winters that finally did it, or was it just that they could not care for their animals because they didn't even know how many they had? They were just so widespread.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to answer that question, but it wasn't economic from the beginning. Too few. I mean, they had fewer cattle than they thought they had. They had a really poor quality animal in most cases, and they took them by book count and all of that. And and then if you look at trying to graze out there, I mean, in the wintertime, you're going to get so many calves born in the wintertime. And that's something I didn't spend a lot of time on, but it's so true. I mean, if these cattle, you're not controlling your breeding. Okay, so these cattle mix and match out there on the open range whenever they want to. And all kinds of cattle, all kinds of calves will be born in really bad weather, and they have no chance of survival at all. And I mean, when we had herds of cow calf units, I mean, during we would time our breeding, so we would get calves in the spring, and we would be out there watching those calves in the spring, those cows in the spring as well, to make sure that we would often have to pull calves we would act as midwives for these cows and make sure that we got as many calves to start with as we possibly could. We can't do that in a range system either.
No.
So the winters are terrible, and all you can do is throw them in with everything else and say this could never work. Okay, and if all the other sins hadn't been committed, it wouldn't have worked, because the winters would have taken so many of those cattle that it just couldn't work.
Right. We had one audience question about breeding, and I'm going to elaborate on it a bit. But the Longhorn cattle that were from Texas, the genetics, were they okay to live as far north as Alberta, or once we brought in the Shorthorns and the Herefords and the British breeds, was that better? Not just for fattening, but for the survival.
Really difficult question. None of them were really capable of survival out there without feed in the terribly cold weather. Probably the Texas Longhorns. I mean, they were so skinny, and you could just imagine. I mean, you've got to have a little bit of fat around you, out there to survive in that really cold weather. But of course, you didn't really get fat cattle here anyway, because the grazing was never really good. The ranges were overstocked, and then the cattle went into the winter when they weren't getting enough to eat anyway. So, I think I just have to say they may be less able to survive than the cattle I've talked about that came from the east, the good cattle that came from the east, but none of them was capable of really reproducing and doing well in weather like this.
One thing I'd like to highlight, and then I'll close out, is in your book you talk about the big roundups, and there were so many cattle that weren't branded, and everybody would be like a free-for-all. They'd all the help would try and grab the unmarked calves and brand them for them, and the big ranches would try and brand them for themselves. So it was not knowing your stock really caused a lot of problems, and some of the outlaws and rustlers did very well because of that, the nature of the husbandry at that time. But I want to thank you, Warren, for providing such a wonderful talk. I personally really enjoyed it, and knowing how wild Alberta was in the frontier age. You claim that it wasn't tame, and I recall that there are stories of when somebody stole some cattle, the Cowboys would all go out with their 6-shooters and they'd try and stop them. A little less wild than the South, but it gives us a better picture than most of us have from watching John Wayne movies or Bonanza or Gunsmoke, but it brings those romantic notions that we've seen on television into perspective. So thank you so much. And I do want to mention to the audience that Warren tested positive for COVID today, and he carried on, and we really appreciate him doing this for us. So over to Elizabeth to let you know about what's coming up. And if you have any questions, send them to the info, and we'll put them forward to Warren for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Warren. I'm just going to say a couple of very quick things about the upcoming events that will finish off our series. There's 2 very exciting speakers coming up. Next week, we'll have Preston Manning appearing live in Victoria Hall, Coburg, and he's going to be speaking to us about the roots of populism. Preston Manning has been called the father of modern Canadian conservatism. He's a historian and a really great storyteller, a very engaging speaker. So I really do urge you to come out and hear him. He'll also be appearing on Friday, the 29th of April in Cobourg for a more intimate seminar session on the movement called Wexit. So that's next week. And then following that, it's time for a bit of fun. We're going to be featuring cowboy and comedian BJ Thomas, who's going to be coming to Cobourg on Thursday, May 5th to talk about horses. And then the next day, he's going to let loose and give us a cowboy comedy concert at the Capitol Theatre in Port Hope. So that's May 6th. So we really hope that you will join us for these great events. Go online and get your tickets. And thank you again, Warren. And may the sun shine tomorrow wherever you are. And thank you again, Warren, for coming out despite not feeling great. You didn't show it. So thanks very much. And good night, everyone. Have a good evening.